Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most significant and complex campaigns of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. This series of surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong against South Vietnamese and American forces in 1968 would become a turning point in the war, challenging the very foundations of U.S. strategy and leaving an indelible mark on the conflict. As we journey through the origins of this pivotal event, we find ourselves in the midst of a complex web of historical context. The Tet Offensive was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of escalating violence, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic planning. In the early 1960s, the United States had begun to increase its involvement in Vietnam, with President John F. Kennedy deploying military advisors to support the government of South Vietnam. However, it was under President Lyndon B. Johnson that U.S. involvement escalated dramatically, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 serving as a catalyst for increased military intervention. The following year, U.S. Marines arrived in Vietnam, marking the beginning of a large-scale American presence in the conflict. As the war intensified, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong began to develop a sophisticated strategy, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain and exploiting the weaknesses of their enemy. In 1966, General Vo Nguyen Giap, the renowned North Vietnamese commander, began to formulate a plan for a comprehensive attack on South Vietnamese and American forces. The cities of Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon, with their bustling streets and historic landmarks, were about to become battlegrounds, as the Communist forces prepared to launch a series of coordinated attacks that would stun the world. The Tet Offensive was not just a military campaign. It was a carefully crafted strategy designed to exploit the weaknesses of the enemy, to create chaos and confusion, and to bring the war home to the people of South Vietnam and the United States. In December 1967, the U.S. military launched Operation Cedar Falls, a massive search-and-destroy mission aimed at rooting out Viet Cong strongholds in the Mekong Delta. This operation, while tactically successful, ultimately failed to weaken the Communist forces' resolve or disrupt their plans for the Tet Offensive. Meanwhile, Giap and his strategists continued to refine their strategy, using intelligence gathered from captured U.S. soldiers, defectors, and sympathizers within the South Vietnamese government. As the Lunar New Year, or Tet, approached in January 1968, the stage was set for a dramatic and bloody confrontation. The Communist forces had carefully selected their targets, timing their attacks to coincide with the traditional ceasefire that accompanied the Tet celebrations. This would allow them to catch the enemy off guard, exploiting the element of surprise to maximum effect. In the months leading up to the offensive, tensions between the United States and North Vietnam had reached a boiling point, with both sides engaging in a war of words and deeds. The U.S. military had increased its bombing campaign against North Vietnamese targets, while the Communist forces had intensified their guerrilla warfare tactics, targeting American and South Vietnamese troops in the countryside. As we explore the origins of the Tet Offensive, it becomes clear that this campaign was not simply a spontaneous uprising, but rather the result of careful planning and strategic calculation. The Communist forces had spent years developing their capabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as the clock ticked down to the launch of the Tet Offensive, the world was about to witness a pivotal moment in the history of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive began on January 30, 1968, as Communist forces launched a series of coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The cities of Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon were among the key targets, with the enemy seeking to capture strategic locations such as government buildings, military bases, and communication centers. The element of surprise was crucial, as the Communist forces had carefully planned their attacks to coincide with the Lunar New Year, or Tet, celebrations, when many South Vietnamese troops were on leave. In Hue, the capital of Thu Thien province, the North Vietnamese Army launched a fierce assault on the city's imperial palace, the Citadel. The U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese forces responded quickly, but they faced stiff resistance from the enemy. The battle for Hue would become one of the bloodiest and most intense of the Tet Offensive, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, the Communist forces targeted key installations such as the U.S. Embassy, the Presidential Palace, and the headquarters of the South Vietnamese General Staff. Although these attacks were ultimately repelled, they created chaos and confusion throughout the city, undermining the confidence of the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. One of the most notable aspects of the Tet Offensive was the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers on both sides. In the midst of intense fighting, individual acts of heroism stood out, such as the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Stanley S. Hughes, who led a U.S. Marine battalion in the Battle for Hue. Despite being wounded, Hughes continued to direct his troops, inspiring them to hold their ground against overwhelming enemy forces. As the Tet Offensive unfolded, it became clear that the Communist forces had achieved a significant psychological victory. The attacks had caught the U.S. military and the South Vietnamese government off guard, creating a sense of crisis and uncertainty. The Johnson administration faced intense criticism at home, with many Americans questioning the wisdom of continued involvement in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive also marked a turning point in the war, as it led to a shift in U.S. strategy. The failure of the Communist forces to achieve their military objectives had come at great cost, with estimates suggesting that between 20,000 to 50,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers were killed or wounded during the offensive. However, the psychological impact of the attacks had been significant, and the U.S. military began to reassess its approach to the war. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, was replaced by General Creighton Abrams, who would oversee a shift towards a more nuanced and flexible strategy. The new approach emphasized pacification, counterinsurgency, and the training of South Vietnamese forces to take over responsibility for their own defense. As we explore the primary events of the Tet Offensive, it becomes clear that this campaign was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, driven by a combination of strategic vision, tactical realities, and human factors. The bravery and sacrifice of soldiers on both sides, the clever planning of General Giap, and the response of the U.S. military all contributed to a pivotal moment in the history of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive marked a significant turning point in the war, as it led to a decline in public support for the conflict in the United States. The Johnson administration faced intense criticism, with many Americans questioning the wisdom of continued involvement in Vietnam. The perception that the war was unwinnable and that the U.S. military was not making progress despite its superior firepower contributed to growing anti-war sentiment. In March 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election, citing the divisions within the country over the war. This decision marked a significant shift in American politics, as it paved the way for the election of Richard Nixon, who campaigned on a promise to end the war. The Tet Offensive also had a profound impact on the U.S. military strategy in Vietnam. The failure of the Communist forces to achieve their military objectives led to a reassessment of the war effort, and General Creighton Abrams, who replaced General William Westmoreland as commander of U.S. Special Forces in Vietnam, implemented a new approach that emphasized pacification, counterinsurgency, and the training of South Vietnamese forces. The aftermath of the Tet Offensive saw a significant increase in the number of U.S. troops withdrawn from Vietnam as part of a policy known as Vietnamization. This policy aimed to transfer responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese military, while the United States provided economic and military aid. However, the withdrawal of U.S. troops also created a power vacuum that the North Vietnamese exploited, ultimately leading to the fall of Saigon in 1975. The Tet Offensive had a lasting impact on American society and foreign policy. It marked a turning point in the relationship between the government and the media, as journalists began to question the official narrative about the war. The campaign also led to increased scrutiny of the U.S. military's tactics and strategies, with many Americans questioning the use of firepower and the treatment of civilians. In the years following the Tet Offensive, the United States began to re-evaluate its role in the world and its approach to foreign policy. The war in Vietnam had exposed the limitations of American power and the dangers of interventionism, leading to a more cautious approach to international relations. The legacy of the Tet Offensive can be seen in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where the United States has struggled to balance its military objectives with the need to win the hearts and minds of local populations. As we reflect on the Tet Offensive, it's clear that this campaign was a pivotal moment in American history, one that continues to shape our understanding of war and foreign policy. The bravery and sacrifice of soldiers on both sides, the clever planning of General Giap, and the response of the U.S. military all contributed to a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that forever changed the course of the Vietnam War. In conclusion, the Tet Offensive was a defining moment in American history, one that marked a turning point in the Vietnam War and had far-reaching consequences for U.S. foreign policy and society. As we continue to grapple with the challenges of international relations and the use of military power, it's essential that we remember the lessons of the Tet Offensive and strive to understand the complexities of war and its impact on human societies. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the Tet Offensive. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.